The silence in Westfield Public Library shattered like glass when the heavy biography of Winston Churchill hit the marble floor with a thunderous crash that echoed through the vaulted ceilings. Isabel Smith, 38, stood frozen behind the circulation desk, her reading glasses hanging from a delicate chain around her neck, watching as the three men in expensive suits sneered at her from across the main reading room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I asked to speak with someone in charge, growled Detective Lieutenant Jake Morrison, his voice cutting through the scholarly atmosphere like a serrated blade. Not some book-stamping nobody who probably thinks tactical means organizing the romance section. The library fell into an uncomfortable hush. Even the ancient heating system seemed to pause its perpetual humming. Isabel's colleagues, Margaret from Reference, Timothy from Children's Services, and David from Archives, suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. Nobody defended her. Nobody even looked her way. Head librarian Dorothy Patterson emerged from her corner office, her sensible heels clicking nervously against the polished floors, despite the noise-dampening policies she usually enforced so strictly. "Detective Morrison," she said, wringing her hands, "I apologize for any confusion. Let me handle this personally. Your website says information specialists." Morrison's voice dripped with condescension as his two companions, Detective Sergeant Ryan Clark and Detective Mike Stevens, formed an intimidating triangle around the circulation desk. "I see amateur volunteers and diversity hires." The words landed like physical blows. Isabel felt them burn, not because of her gender, but because they assumed she was hired to fill quotas, rather than for expertise. She had heard similar dismissals before, countless times over the past 7 years in Westfield, but today something felt different. What they didn't know was that Isabel carried secrets that could change everything if she dared to reveal them. "I can help you," Isabel said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper yet somehow carrying more authority than Morrison's booming commands. The library fell completely silent. She had never volunteered for high-profile cases, never challenged the established hierarchy that kept her safely invisible. Margaret shifted uncomfortably behind the reference desk. Timothy clutched his stack of picture books tighter, his knuckles white with tension. David gripped his archival gloves like they were lifelines. Detective Stevens stepped forward with theatrical disgust, his badge catching the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. "Look at this," he announced loudly enough for patrons 3 floors up to hear. "She's probably never seen a police report that wasn't in some crime novel. Bet she learned about investigations from watching TV mysteries." Clark laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that ricocheted off the leather-bound volumes lining the walls. "My wife reads those romance novels with the cops on the covers. Maybe they could start a book club together." Isabel's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the circulation desk. These weren't just any hands. Scars from years of precise training crossed her palms, scars she'd learned to explain away as childhood accidents or gardening mishaps. Her fingernails, kept short by necessity, bore faint calluses that spoke of activities far more demanding than turning pages. But she had learned to hide her strength, to appear less capable than reality demanded. Survival in Westfield required invisibility. "The pattern analysis indicates a sophisticated operation," Isabel continued, her voice steady, despite the mockery surrounding her. "Your perpetrator has been escalating systematically. The gaps between incidents are decreasing by 18% each time, and the geographical spread follows a tactical advancement pattern that suggests military or law enforcement training." Morrison stopped mid-insult. That level of analytical precision required either extraordinary luck or genuine expertise in criminal psychology and tactical assessment. "She read that online," Stevens insisted, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Anyone can memorize police jargon these days." "Then let anyone solve it," Isabel replied, meeting Morrison's skeptical gaze directly. "But when your case goes cold and the media starts asking why 3 experienced detectives couldn't catch someone operating right under their noses, remember you had the chance to accept help." Dorothy grabbed Isabel's arm, not roughly, but firmly. Fear radiated from the head librarian rather than anger. The library depended on good relationships with local law enforcement. Offending police detectives could mean the end of security funding, reduced cooperation on research requests, and potential budget cuts that would devastate their community programs. "Isabel, return to your duties immediately." Dorothy's voice carried a desperation that wasn't entirely about the current situation. She had hired Isabel 7 years ago, when the younger woman had appeared with impeccable references, but an inexplicable willingness to work for half the salary she was qualified to earn. Isabel looked at her supervisor, seeing the desperation in Dorothy's eyes, the same desperation that had driven her to accept this position 7 years ago when she had nowhere else to go and everything to lose. "The crime scene photos show evidence staging," Isabel told Morrison directly, her voice low but clear. "Your perpetrator wants to be caught, but only by someone worthy of the challenge. You have maybe 72 hours before he escalates to something that can't be undone. Your choice." A small child's cry from the children's section punctuated the tension, followed by Timothy's gentle shushing. The normal sounds of library life continued around them, the soft whisper of turning pages, the muted clicking of keyboards, the subtle hum of the air filtration system, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Margaret whistled low from behind a stack of returned books. She had seen that look in Isabel's eyes before, during staff meetings when budget cuts threatened their programs. It was the look of someone who understood systems and strategies in ways that went far beyond organizing information and helping patrons find resources. But admitting Isabel's expertise meant acknowledging 7 years of treating her like just another quiet librarian who was content to remain in the background, processing returns and answering routine questions about overdue fines. As Isabel retreated to the employee break room, a cramped space behind the stacks that smelled of instant coffee and photocopier toner, her hands shook. 7 years of silence. 7 years of accepting condescension with grace. 7 years of pretending ignorance to avoid conflict. All of it was crashing down because she couldn't watch a dangerous situation escalate when she had the skills to prevent it. Her phone buzzed with a message from a number she hadn't seen in years, a Virginia area code that made her stomach clench. She deleted it without reading, but the damage was done. Memories she had buried deep began clawing their way to the surface. Little did she know that the deleted message contained news that would change everything about her carefully constructed life in Westfield. In her employee locker, beneath cardigans that had seen better days and a thermal coffee mug decorated with literary quotes, lay her personal bag. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, were items that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, precision instruments that had once been extensions of her very soul. A photograph was tucked between them, her father standing beside her at graduation, pride radiating from every angle. His handwriting on the back remained legible despite years of handling. "My daughter, leadership isn't about rank. It's about knowing when to step forward." Outside, she could hear Morrison's raised voice as he berated Dorothy about the unprofessional behavior of her staff. David and Margaret whispered urgently near the periodicals section, their concern evident even through the closed break room door. The sound of frustration in Morrison's voice grew worse, the anger of someone who knew he was out of his depth but couldn't admit it. Isabel closed the locker, photograph still in her hand. Her father wouldn't recognize the woman she had become, hiding expertise to avoid conflict, accepting disrespect to maintain peace. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps dignity could be reclaimed not through confrontation but through undeniable demonstration. Morrison's voice rose again, the sound of a case going nowhere fast while a dangerous criminal remained free. Isabel made her decision, though she knew that stepping into the light would mean abandoning the shadows that had protected her for 7 years. What the detectives didn't understand was that some people choose invisibility not from weakness, but from the knowledge that true strength sometimes requires patience. And Isabel Smith's patience was about to run out. No. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days later, the atmosphere in Westfield Public Library had thickened like fog rolling in from the coast. Isabel arrived early, as always, but found the building buzzing with an energy that made her chest tighten. Word had spread about the police incident, and not in her favor. "Morning, Isabel," Margaret called from the reference desk, but her usual warm tone carried a sharp edge that hadn't been there before. Timothy nodded curtly from behind a cart of children's books, while only David offered his customary gentle smile, though even he seemed more cautious than usual. Dorothy emerged from her office, clipboard clutched like armor against her chest, her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Isabel, we need to talk." Her heart sank. The private conversation she had been dreading for 3 days was finally here. "Look," Dorothy began once they were alone in her cramped office, surrounded by budget reports and library policy manuals. "That situation with the police, it's got the board asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Isabel asked, though she already knew. "About whether we're maintaining professional boundaries. About whether our staff understands their role in community relations." Dorothy paused, searching for diplomatic words. "About whether we're running a library or some kind of consulting service for untrained volunteers." The words stung because they were so far from the truth. Isabel had been analyzing patterns and solving complex problems since she could read. She had earned advanced degrees in criminal justice and strategic studies with highest honors. She had once led teams of analysts in situations where lives hung in the balance. But here in Westfield, her resume began and ended with checking out books and helping patrons find the restroom. "I was trying to help," Isabel said quietly. "Those detectives were missing crucial patterns that could prevent serious crimes. That's not the point." Dorothy's voice carried frustration that wasn't entirely directed at Isabel. "This is a small community. People talk. Mrs. Henderson from the Historical Society heard from her nephew at the police department that you supposedly embarrassed some veteran detectives, made them look incompetent. I did my job. Your job is what I say it is." The words came out harsher than Dorothy intended. She softened slightly, but the damage was done. "Look, I value you. You're reliable, punctual, and you don't cause drama. But I've got a library to run, and community support keeps our doors open." Isabel understood the unspoken message. Stay invisible or find another job. In Westfield, there weren't many options for a woman whose real qualifications would raise too many questions. "I understand," she said, though the words tasted bitter. "Good, I'm glad we're clear." Dorothy stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Oh, and Isabel, Detective Morrison is coming back this afternoon. Some kind of follow-up on that case. I want Margaret handling any police interactions personally." As Isabel returned to the circulation desk, she caught fragments of whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she appeared. Words like overstepping and know-it-all floated through the air like toxic fumes. She had heard them before, in different contexts, in different cities, but they always carried the same message: know your place. David approached her station as she began processing returned books, a mindless task that usually brought comfort, but today felt like penance. "You holding up okay?" he asked quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. The following week brought an unusual chill to Westfield that seemed to settle into Isabel's bones. She arrived at the library each morning to find the atmosphere growing increasingly hostile. Patrons who had once smiled politely now avoided eye contact entirely. The regular visitors, elderly Mr. Rodriguez who came for the daily newspapers, young mothers bringing children for story time, college students seeking quiet study spaces, all treated her with newfound suspicion. Dorothy called her into the office on Thursday afternoon, her face grave as storm clouds. "I've got a problem, Isabel," she began without preamble, not bothering with pleasantries, "a big one." Isabel sat in the worn chair across from Dorothy's desk, noting how her supervisor couldn't quite meet her eyes. The office felt smaller than usual, cramped with the weight of unspoken accusations. "Detective Morrison has been asking questions about you," Dorothy continued, her voice carrying a tremor Isabel had never heard before, "about your background, about where you learned to analyze criminal behavior like some kind of federal profiler." Isabel's mouth went dry. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that attract attention from people higher up the food chain than local police." Dorothy finally looked at her directly, and Isabel saw fear there, raw, genuine fear. "Isabel, I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Is there anything in your past that could hurt this library? Anything that could bring the wrong kind of scrutiny to our institution?" The question hung between them like a loaded weapon. Isabel thought about her life before Westfield, the classified operations, the congressional testimonies behind closed doors, the resignation letter that had been buried so deep it might as well have never existed, the non-disclosure agreements she'd signed, the security clearances that had been quietly revoked, the official records that showed she'd never existed in certain capacities. "Everyone has a past, Dorothy," Isabel said carefully. "That's not an answer," Dorothy's voice hardened with desperation. "I've got community trust to maintain and board members asking why our, quote, information specialists seem to know more about criminal investigations than actual police detectives." "I've never done anything illegal," Isabel interrupted, the partial truth feeling like lead in her mouth. "I've never been arrested, never been charged with anything. I pay my taxes and do my job." But she sighed, knowing that partial truth was better than outright lies. "I used to work for a government agency in Virginia. It didn't end well. I came here for a fresh start." Dorothy leaned back in her chair, processing this information with the methodical approach of someone who had spent decades managing information systems. What kind of government work? Analysis, strategic assessment, the kind of work that doesn't exist in small towns. Jesus, Isabel. Dorothy rubbed her temples, and Isabel could practically see her calculating the potential damage to the library's reputation. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why take a job shelving books when you could have been working for think tanks or consulting firms?" "Because sometimes you need to disappear," Isabel said quietly. "Sometimes starting over means starting at the bottom." Before Dorothy could respond, the library's main door chimed with an electronic tone that seemed sharper than usual. Through the office window, Isabel saw a black sedan pull into the parking lot with the distinctive, careful precision of government vehicles. Two people emerged, a woman in a sharp business suit, and a man whose posture screamed federal agent even without visible identification. "Ms. Patterson?" The woman approached the office with confident strides that made her heels sound like gunshots on the marble floor. "I'm Agent Sarah Chen, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. This is Agent Robert Martinez. We'd like to speak with one of your employees." Isabel closed her eyes, knowing that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to sudden light. "Which employee?" Dorothy asked, though her glance toward Isabel made the answer obvious. "Isabel Smith. We understand she recently provided analysis to local law enforcement regarding an ongoing criminal investigation." The next hour unfolded like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The agents were professional but thorough, asking questions about her qualifications, her analytical methods, her knowledge of criminal psychology and tactical assessment. Isabel answered carefully, sticking to facts while revealing as little as possible about her former life. "Ms. Smith," Agent Chen said finally, consulting a tablet that seemed to contain far more information than Isabel was comfortable with. "Our preliminary investigation suggests you have expertise that's unusual for someone in your current position." "I read extensively," Isabel replied, using the same deflection that had served her for 7 years. "Reading is one thing," Agent Martinez interjected, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone accustomed to extracting information from reluctant subjects. "But the behavioral analysis you provided to Detective Morrison demonstrates knowledge of classified operational patterns." Isabel felt trapped in a web she'd accidentally woven herself. Admitting her true background would invite scrutiny she couldn't afford, but continuing to deny her expertise would only make her look more suspicious to people trained to spot deception. "I have advanced degrees in criminal justice and psychology," she said, offering a fragment of truth. "I stay current with research in the field." The agents exchanged glances that spoke of silent communication perfected through years of partnership. Agent Chen pulled up another screen on her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a lengthy document. "According to our records," she said slowly, "Isabel Smith has been employed at this library for 7 years. Before that, there's very little documentation of your existence, no employment history with any major institution, no published research, no digital footprint consistent with someone holding advanced degrees in specialized fields." Isabel's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. She had been so careful to build her new identity slowly, paying cash for everything, avoiding the kind of paper trail that would connect her to her former life. But apparently that very caution had made her suspicious to people whose job it was to investigate anomalies. "I value my privacy," she said. "Privacy is one thing," Agent Martinez replied, "but this level of operational security requires significant effort and expertise. Almost like someone was trying to hide from very specific types of searches." Dorothy looked back and forth between Isabel and the agents, her face growing paler with each exchange. The implications were becoming clear. Her quiet, reliable librarian was either hiding something significant or was involved in something that attracted federal attention. Neither possibility was good for the library's reputation or funding. "Gentlemen, agents," Dorothy stammered, "I can vouch for Isabel. She's been a model employee, never missed a day, never caused any trouble." "We're not questioning her work ethic," Agent Chen replied diplomatically. "We're trying to understand how she acquired knowledge that should be limited to people with very specific security clearances and operational experience." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Isabel realized that her attempt to remain invisible had backfired spectacularly. By trying to hide her qualifications, she had only made herself more interesting to people who investigated professional anomalies for a living. "I think," Isabel said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind, "I need to make a phone call." The agents nodded. "We'll wait." Isabel stepped outside the library, her hands shaking as she scrolled through contacts she hadn't accessed in years. She found a number she'd memorized but never called, a Virginia area code that represented both salvation and potential destruction. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Naval Personnel Command. How may I direct your call?" "I need to speak with Admiral Rebecca Hayes," Isabel said, using a name she hadn't spoken aloud in 7 years. "Tell her it's about Operation Blackwater." While she waited for the call to be transferred, Isabel watched through the library windows as Agent Chen and Agent Martinez spoke quietly with Dorothy, who was gesturing frantically as she tried to process the idea that her mild-mannered librarian might be connected to classified military operations. David stood near the reference desk, his concern evident even from across the parking lot. Margaret and Timothy huddled near the periodicals, their whispered conversation undoubtedly focused on the federal agents currently occupying their workplace. "Isabel?" The voice on the phone was older, weathered by years of command decisions, but unmistakably familiar. "Is it really you?" "Hello, Admiral. I need help." 7 years of radio silence, and now you're calling? This must be serious. "Federal agents are asking questions about my background, and I can't explain my qualifications without violating operational security protocols." A long pause. "What kind of agents?" "NCIS. They think I might have access to classified information because I helped local police with a criminal profile." "Isabel, you need to know. Your operational files were declassified last month. The whole Blackwater investigation has been reopened based on new intelligence." Isabel's knees nearly buckled. "What kind of intelligence?" "The kind that proves you were right all along. The kind that's going to make some very powerful people very uncomfortable." As she ended the call, Isabel realized that her quiet life in Westfield was over. The past she'd tried so desperately to escape was about to collide with the present she'd built, and she wasn't sure either version of herself would survive the impact. She walked back into the library, straightening her shoulders with the unconscious precision of someone whose posture had once conveyed authority to rooms full of military personnel. If her anonymity was gone, then perhaps it was time to stop hiding. "Agents," she said, her voice carrying a new note of command that made both federal investigators look up sharply. "I think it's time we had a more detailed conversation." The conference room at the Westfield Police Department felt smaller than a submarine compartment as Isabel sat facing Agents Chen and Martinez across a scratched metal table. Dorothy fidgeted nervously beside her, clutching a folder of Isabel's employment records like a shield. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look like suspects. "Before we begin," Agent Chen said, placing a digital recorder on the table with deliberate precision, "I want to clarify that you're not under arrest or suspicion of wrongdoing. However, given the nature of the information involved, we need to establish exactly who we're dealing with." Isabel nodded, her hands folded calmly in her lap. After 7 years of hiding, the prospect of telling the truth felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. "My name is Isabel Smith," she began, "but that wasn't always my name. Until 7 years ago, I was Commander Isabel Catherine Morgan, United States Navy SEALs." Dorothy's jaw dropped so hard Isabel heard her teeth click. Agent Martinez leaned forward, suddenly much more interested than he'd appeared moments before. "Commander Morgan," Agent Chen repeated, consulting her tablet with new urgency. "That explains a considerable amount. You led Task Force Neptune during Operation Blackwater." "You know about Blackwater?" Isabel asked, surprised. "We know what's in the official files," Agent Martinez replied carefully, "but there seem to be significant gaps in the record. Classified sections that were sealed under national security protocols." Dorothy found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Commander, you're telling me you've been checking out library books for 7 years, when you used to command Navy SEALs?" Isabel felt a complex mixture of pride and pain hearing her old ranks spoken aloud. "I led a specialized unit focused on counterterrorism operations in hostile territories. We handled situations that required both tactical precision and strategic analysis." "What happened?" Agent Chen asked, though her tone suggested she already had pieces of the puzzle. Isabel took a deep breath and began the story she'd never told anyone in Westfield. She spoke about Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, her former commanding officer, who had systematically undermined her missions and stolen credit for her tactical innovations. About the classified operation in Syria where her recommendations had been ignored, leading to casualties that could have been prevented. About the congressional hearing where she'd testified about systemic failures in command structure, only to watch her own career be systematically destroyed. "The official record shows that Commander Morgan resigned due to personal reasons," Agent Martinez observed, "but there's a sealed investigation file that suggests something very different." "Webb had connections throughout the Pentagon," Isabel continued, her voice steady despite the painful memories. "When I refused to stay quiet about the operational failures that cost lives, he made sure my testimony was buried. The investigation was classified, my service record was altered, and I was given a choice: accept a quiet resignation with full honors, or face a court-martial on trumped-up charges." "And that's why you disappeared," Agent Chen said, understanding dawning in her expression. "You took the resignation to protect classified operations, but it effectively ended your military career." "More than that," Isabel replied. "The non-disclosure agreements I signed prevented me from discussing any of my operational experience. I was banned from seeking employment with any defense contractor or federal agency for 10 years. Webb made sure I couldn't work anywhere that would value my actual qualifications." Dorothy stared at Isabel as if seeing her for the first time. "You've been working at minimum wage, shelving books and helping people find romance novels, when you're one of the most decorated military commanders in recent history. Would you have hired me if I'd told you the truth?" Isabel asked gently. "A disgraced former Navy SEAL commander with a history of challenging authority and classified legal troubles? Or would you have assumed I was too volatile, too much of a risk?" Dorothy fell silent, knowing Isabel was right. The library board would never have approved hiring someone with that kind of complicated background, regardless of her qualifications. Agent Martinez closed his tablet. "Commander Morgan, Isabel, we need to discuss your current situation. Operation Blackwater has been reopened based on new evidence." "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that proves every concern you raised in your testimony was accurate," Agent Chen replied. "Digital forensics recovered from Webb's personal devices show he deliberately ignored your intelligence reports. Email communications prove he falsified mission briefings to make his decisions appear sound while discrediting your recommendations." Isabel felt tears threatening, but she blinked them back. 7 years of carrying the weight of those lost lives, wondering if she could have done something different, and now learning that her original assessments had been correct all along. "There's more," Agent Martinez continued. "Webb has been under investigation for selling classified tactical information to defense contractors. The same operational strategies you developed are being marketed as his innovations. The intelligence community wants to discuss reinstating your clearance and offering you a position with the Joint Chiefs," Agent Chen added. "Your expertise in counterterrorism strategy and tactical analysis is needed for several classified operations." The words hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone who had been drowning for 7 years. Isabel felt the overwhelming pull of vindication, of returning to work that mattered on a global scale. "There's something else," Agent Martinez said. "Detective Morrison's inquiry wasn't random curiosity. He's been advocating for your reinstatement, arguing that local law enforcement needs advisors who can think strategically about emerging threats." "Morrison defended me?" Isabel asked, genuinely surprised. "He said, and I quote," Agent Chen read from her notes, "anyone who can profile a sophisticated criminal operation using only basic police reports, while being dismissed by everyone around her, is exactly the kind of strategic thinker we need advising on homeland security." Dorothy shook her head in amazement. 7 years. You've been here 7 years. And I had you organizing the children's section while you could have been briefing generals and designing counterterrorism operations. I wasn't ready for that life again, Isabel admitted. I needed time to heal, to figure out who I was without the military structure defining my identity. And now? Agent Martinez asked. Isabel looked around the stark conference room, thinking about the library, where she'd spent 7 years rebuilding not just her life but her understanding of what it meant to serve others. She thought about David, who had treated her with respect from day one. About the quiet satisfaction of helping patrons find information that mattered to them. About the simplicity of solving problems without politics or bureaucratic interference. Now I know exactly who I am, she said firmly. I'm a strategist who's learned the value of listening before speaking. I'm someone who can analyze threats from both tactical and human perspectives. I'm a woman who won't be defined by other people's expectations or their attempts to silence me. She paused, meeting each person's gaze around the table. I'm ready to reclaim my career, but I won't abandon the principles that brought me here. Agent Chen smiled, the first genuine warmth Isabel had seen from either federal agent. Then let's talk about your future. The Pentagon has several operations that could use your expertise, and with your experience in both strategic planning and community integration, you'd be invaluable. What about Lieutenant Colonel Webb? Dorothy asked. Webb will be arrested within the week, Agent Martinez replied. Federal charges of treason, fraud, and conspiracy. He's looking at significant prison time. For 7 years, Isabel had dreamed of this moment. Vindication, justice, recognition of the truth. But now that it had arrived, she felt strangely detached from any desire for revenge. Her focus had shifted from personal grievance to larger purpose. I want to think about the offers, she said finally, all of them. I've been making decisions based on fear for too long. I want to make this choice from a position of strength. Of course, Agent Chen said, standing. But Isabel, Commander Morgan, don't take too long. The world needs strategic thinkers like you. The country needs people who can see threats others miss and aren't afraid to speak truth to power. As the agents gathered their materials, Dorothy turned to Isabel with a mixture of awe and regret. I owe you an enormous apology. I should have recognized your capabilities. You gave me work when I needed it, Isabel interrupted. You gave me a place to heal and grow. That's not something to apologize for. What happens now? To the library, I mean. Isabel smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in weeks. Now you hire better researchers. You promote David to senior reference specialist. He's got excellent instincts for complex investigations. And you remember that expertise comes in many forms, not just the ones that look familiar. As they left the police station, Isabel felt the weight of 7 years of secrecy lifting from her shoulders. The truth was finally out, and she was still standing. More than that, she was ready to serve again, but this time on her own terms. The question now wasn't whether she was qualified for the opportunities being offered. It was which one would let her make the biggest difference while staying true to the person she'd become during her years of exile in Westfield. The news spread through Westfield like wildfire in drought season. Within hours of the federal agent's visit, everyone in town knew that the quiet librarian who had been checking out their books for 7 years was actually a decorated Navy SEAL commander who had been living in hiding. The story had everything a small town craved: mystery, government intrigue, and the dramatic revelation that the woman they'd all underestimated was actually a military hero. Isabel arrived at work the next morning to find a circus waiting for her. Local news vans occupied every available parking space, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. National media trucks had arrived overnight, drawn by the human interest angle of a Navy SEAL working incognito at a public library. Reporters thrust microphones at her as she tried to reach the front entrance. Commander Morgan, what's it like being vindicated after 7 years? Will you be returning to active duty? How does it feel to know your former commanding officer is facing federal charges? Isabel pushed through the crowd without comment, but inside the library she found even more chaos. The phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, military recruiters, and former colleagues who had suddenly remembered her existence. Margaret and Timothy stood near the circulation desk, their faces mixing curiosity with something that looked disturbingly like shame. "Morning, Commander Morgan," Margaret said awkwardly, emphasizing the military title she'd never known existed. "It's still Isabel," she replied, pulling on her cardigan with the same deliberate calm she'd maintained for 7 years. "Nothing fundamental has changed." "Everything's changed," Timothy muttered, his voice barely audible. "We've been working next to a genuine war hero for 7 years and treating her like a colleague," Isabel finished firmly, "which is exactly what I needed." David approached with a cup of coffee and his characteristic gentle smile, though she could see questions burning behind his eyes. "How are you holding up with all this attention?" "Better than expected," Isabel admitted, though she could have done without the media scrutiny. "The truth has a way of being easier to carry than secrets." Dorothy emerged from her office looking haggard, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd spent the night fielding calls from the library board, city officials, and concerned citizens. "Isabel, I've had 23 calls this morning. 17 from news outlets, 4 from what sound like government agencies, and 2 from people claiming to be documentary filmmakers." "I'm sorry about the disruption," Isabel said, meaning it sincerely. "Don't apologize." Dorothy's voice carried a note of wonder that hadn't been there the day before. "Do you have any idea how many requests we've gotten for interviews about your time here? The American Library Association wants to feature you in their next conference. 3 universities have inquired about having you speak on intelligence gathering and information literacy." Before Isabel could respond, the library's main door opened with its familiar electronic chime. A woman in an expensive navy dress uniform entered, her movements carrying the crisp precision of active military service. The media outside seemed to recognize her importance. Cameras flashed through the windows as reporters jockeyed for better angles. "Commander Morgan?" The woman approached with confidence earned through years of command experience. "I'm Captain Angela Foster, Special Operations Command. I flew down from Norfolk as soon as I heard you'd been located." Isabel felt her posture automatically straighten, muscle memory responding to the presence of a superior officer despite 7 years of civilian life. "Captain Foster, I wasn't expecting official contact so quickly. With respect, Commander, you've been missing in action for 7 years. When NCIS confirmed your identity yesterday, Admiral Hayes personally ordered me to extend an immediate invitation for reinstatement." The library had fallen completely silent. Even the constant ringing of phones seemed to pause, as staff and patrons absorbed the reality of military officers conducting official business in their quiet community space. "What kind of reinstatement?" Isabel asked, though she suspected she already knew. Captain Foster pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be official orders. "Full restoration of rank and security clearance retroactive to your resignation date. Command of a new joint task force focused on domestic counter-terrorism intelligence. Base assignment of your choosing, with unlimited operational authority." The offer hung in the air like a bridge back to everything Isabel had lost 7 years ago. Dorothy's eyes widened as she processed the magnitude of what was being offered. Not just a return to military service, but a promotion to the kind of position that would put Isabel among the most powerful intelligence officers in the country. "There's more," Captain Foster continued. "The Pentagon wants to implement your community integration protocols on a national scale. Your model of embedding intelligence analysis within civilian institutions would revolutionize how we identify and respond to emerging threats." Isabel looked around the library that had been her sanctuary for 7 years, seeing it through new eyes. The quiet reading areas where she'd helped patrons research everything from genealogy to graduate school applications. The children's section where she'd watched kids discover the magic of learning. The reference desk where David had shown her that intellectual curiosity could exist without ambition or agenda. "My protocols?" she asked. "Your work here has been extraordinary," Captain Foster explained. "You've demonstrated that intelligence analysis doesn't require isolation from civilian communities. You've proven that the best threat assessment comes from understanding local patterns and building genuine relationships with the people you're protecting." Margaret stepped forward hesitantly. "Are you saying that Isabel's work here was some kind of undercover assignment?" "No," Captain Foster replied firmly. "Commander Morgan's residence in Westfield was entirely personal, but her integration into this community, her development of local information networks, her ability to identify threats through civilian channels, it's become a model for how intelligence professionals should operate in domestic environments." Isabel felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort. Her quiet years in Westfield hadn't been a strategic operation, but apparently they demonstrated something valuable about the intersection of intelligence work and community service. "I need time to consider this," she said finally. Captain Foster nodded respectfully. "Of course. But Commander, I should mention that Detective Morrison has been in contact with Special Operations Command. He specifically requested that any task force you lead include training protocols for local law enforcement." "Morrison requested that?" Isabel asked, genuinely surprised. "He was quite insistent. Said that if you could identify criminal patterns that his department missed, local police nationwide needed access to that kind of strategic thinking." As Captain Foster prepared to leave, she paused at the circulation desk. "Commander, there's one more thing. Lieutenant Colonel Webb will be formally charged on Monday. The Pentagon wanted you to know that your original testimony has been declassified and will be entered as primary evidence in his court-martial." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. For 7 years, Isabel had carried the burden of classified knowledge about operational failures that had cost lives. Now, finally, that knowledge would serve justice rather than remain buried in bureaucratic silence. After the captain left, the library seemed to exhale collectively. The staff gathered around Isabel's workstation, their expressions mixing admiration with bewilderment. "So what happens now?" Timothy asked quietly. Isabel looked at the faces surrounding her. Colleagues who had become friends, people who had accepted her without needing to know her credentials or accomplishments. "Now I have to decide whether I'm ready to leave the best job I've ever had." "The best job?" Dorothy asked incredulously. "Isabel, you were commanding Navy SEALs, designing counterterrorism operations, briefing generals. How could working in a small-town library possibly compare to that?" Isabel smiled, thinking about the difference between commanding respect through rank and earning it through daily actions. "Because here, I learned that the most important intelligence isn't about identifying threats. It's about understanding people. Every patron who asked for help taught me something about human nature that no military briefing ever could." She paused, looking around the space that had sheltered and transformed her. 7 years ago, I thought my career was about eliminating enemies. Now I understand it's about protecting communities. And I learned that here, from all of you." As the day continued, Isabel found herself caught between two worlds: the high-stakes environment of military intelligence and the quiet satisfaction of community service. The decision she faced wasn't just about career advancement. It was about choosing which version of herself she wanted to be moving forward. But perhaps, she realized, it didn't have to be an either-or choice. Perhaps the real innovation would be finding a way to bridge both worlds, bringing the lessons she'd learned in Westfield to the broader challenge of keeping America safe. 2 weeks later, the transformation of Westfield Public Library had reached a scale that nobody could have anticipated. Pentagon consultants arrived daily to study Isabel's community intelligence model, while reporters continued documenting what they called the most remarkable case of hidden identity in modern American history. The quiet sanctuary that had sheltered Isabel for 7 years had become ground zero for a national conversation about intelligence, community, and the hidden potential of ordinary people. But success, Isabel had learned, often attracted the wrong kind of attention. The challenge came from an unexpected source: Congressman William Hartley, whose district included Westfield. Hartley had built his political career on opposing what he called government overreach and military-industrial waste. The Pentagon's sudden interest in a small-town library struck him as both a perfect target for his next campaign and a suspicious use of taxpayer resources. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hartley announced during a press conference on the courthouse steps, his voice carrying the practiced outrage of a career politician, "we have a situation where the Department of Defense is preparing to spend millions studying how a disgraced former military officer shelved books for 7 years. This isn't innovation. This is bureaucratic insanity disguised as homeland security." Isabel watched the news coverage from the library's break room, her stomach knotting with familiar anxiety. She'd faced political opposition before during the Webb investigation, and she knew how quickly public opinion could shift when complex situations were reduced to soundbites and campaign talking points. "This is different," Dorothy assured her, though uncertainty clouded her voice. "People here know you. They've seen what you've accomplished, how you've helped this community. Politicians are skilled at making reality irrelevant, Isabel replied, remembering how Webb had manipulated congressional hearings 7 years earlier. If Hartley wants to make this about government waste instead of community security, he might succeed. Her fears proved justified within days. Hartley's supporters launched a coordinated campaign questioning every aspect of Isabel's story. Local newspapers received anonymous tips about excessive military spending on unproven intelligence methods. Social media campaigns portrayed Isabel as a failed officer living off taxpayer money while contributing nothing to national security. The attacks culminated in a town hall meeting where Hartley demanded accountability for what he called the militarization of American libraries. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with residents, reporters, and political operatives filling every available seat. Isabel knew this was her moment of truth, the chance to defend not just her work, but the principle that community service and national security could strengthen each other rather than compete for resources. Dr. Morgan, Hartley began, deliberately using the wrong title to subtly undermine her military credentials. Can you explain to these taxpayers why the Pentagon is considering spending $5.2 million to study your library work when those same funds could support veteran health care or infrastructure improvements? Isabel had prepared for this question, but seeing Hartley's theatrical concern triggered memories of similar interrogations during the Webb hearings. For a moment, she felt the familiar urge to retreat, to apologize for taking up space and resources. Then she looked past Hartley to see David in the audience, wearing a Navy Reserve uniform he'd earned after Isabel had encouraged him to pursue military service. Beside him sat Margaret, who had enrolled in a graduate program in information security after Isabel had helped her recognize her analytical abilities. Timothy was there too, holding a certificate from the Department of Homeland Security for completing an advanced threat assessment course. "Congressman Hartley," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "I can justify every penny, but more importantly, I can prove that those dollars have produced something invaluable. People who understand that security isn't just about military force. It's about knowing your community well enough to protect it." "Pretty words," Hartley replied dismissively, "but what tangible results can you show? What measurable return on investment?" Isabel stood, her movement drawing every eye in the packed community center. She had learned over 7 years of hiding and 2 weeks of scrutiny that some moments demanded presence rather than words. "David Chen," she called out, using his correct surname for the first time in public. "Would you stand, please?" David rose from his seat, his reserve insignia catching the overhead lights. 2 weeks ago, David was helping patrons find genealogy resources and organizing historical archives. Today, he is designing information security protocols for military libraries nationwide. Last week, his threat assessment model identified potential security vulnerabilities that could have compromised classified research at 17 installations. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Hartley's expression tightened as he realized the direction of Isabel's response. "Margaret Williams, please stand." Margaret rose awkwardly, still uncomfortable with public attention but unable to hide her pride in recent accomplishments. Margaret spent 15 years believing her analytical skills were limited to helping people find the right books. 3 weeks ago, she identified patterns in library patron behavior that led to the arrest of a domestic terrorism cell planning attacks on 3 college campuses. Her methodology is now being taught at the FBI Academy. The murmurs grew louder, more supportive. Hartley tried to interrupt, but Isabel continued with the measured authority of someone accustomed to briefing hostile audiences. "Timothy Rodriguez, please stand." Timothy stood with quiet dignity, his mother beaming from the row behind him. Timothy discovered that his learning differences actually made him exceptionally gifted at pattern recognition that others missed. He's now developing early warning systems that monitor social media for signs of violent extremism. His work has already prevented 2 potential school shootings and identified dozens of individuals who needed mental health intervention before they became threats. The community center had fallen completely silent except for the clicking of camera shutters and the scratch of reporters' pens. "Congressman Hartley asked for measurable returns on investment," Isabel continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Here's what that investment has produced. 3 individuals who went from routine community service to designing the future of domestic security. Threat assessment innovations that will save countless lives. training protocols that will be implemented nationwide. Most importantly, proof that America's greatest security asset isn't our technology or our military hardware, it's our people when they're given the chance to develop their potential. She paused, looking directly at Hartley. But there's something else that investment has produced, something that can't be measured in dollars or statistics. It's produced hope. Hope for communities that thought their contributions to national security didn't matter. Hope for individuals who believe their talents were too ordinary to make a difference. Hope that we can protect America by understanding and strengthening our communities, not by militarizing them. Isabel gestured toward the audience, where dozens of Westfield residents had gathered to support both her and the programs that had grown from her work. Look around this room, Congressman. These are the faces of America's hidden potential. These are the people who will solve tomorrow's security challenges if we give them today's opportunities. Every dollar invested in their development returns tenfold in innovation, service, and genuine security. The silence stretched as Hartley seemed to struggle for a response that wouldn't make him appear to be opposing community development and national security simultaneously. Finally, he managed, "That's very inspiring, Dr. Morgan, but inspiration doesn't justify the kind of massive federal expenditure being proposed. Doesn't it?" Isabel asked quietly. When inspiration produces innovation that saves lives, when it transforms ordinary citizens into extraordinary guardians of their communities, when it proves that America's strength comes not from our ability to project force abroad, but from our capacity to recognize and develop talent at home. She walked closer to Hartley's table, her presence commanding the room's attention in a way that 7 years of quiet library work had never prepared the audience to expect. "You want to know about waste, Congressman? Waste is having brilliant people organize book returns for 15 years because nobody recognized their strategic thinking abilities. Waste is losing the war against domestic terrorism because we can't identify threats that are hiding in plain sight. Waste is building walls between military and civilian communities instead of bridges that make us all safer." Isabel returned to her seat, but her voice carried clearly through the silent community center. This program doesn't waste taxpayer money, it multiplies it. Every dollar invested here produces security professionals, innovative solutions, and community capabilities that didn't exist before. More importantly, it produces citizens who understand that their value to this country isn't determined by their job title or educational background, but by their willingness to serve when called upon. The town hall continued for another hour, but the tone had shifted completely. Hartley's questions became increasingly defensive while community members provided testimony about the program's impact. Local business owners spoke about increased economic activity. Parents described how their children had been inspired to pursue careers in public service. Veterans shared stories about how Isabel's approach had helped them transition from military to civilian life while maintaining their sense of purpose. When the meeting concluded, Isabel felt cautiously optimistic. She had defended her work honestly and thoroughly, but political decisions weren't always based on facts or community support. That evening, as she cleaned up the library after another day of intense scrutiny, her phone rang with a call from Captain Foster. "Isabel, I wanted you to hear this directly from me. Congressman Hartley just announced that he's withdrawing his opposition to the program. More than that, he's requesting additional funding to expand it to other districts." Isabel sank into a chair, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. What changed his mind? According to his staff, he spent the afternoon talking to David, Margaret, and Timothy. Apparently, hearing their stories directly, not filtered through political rhetoric, made him understand what you've actually accomplished here. As Isabel ended the call, she looked around the library that had become so much more than a workplace. It was a symbol of second chances, a proving ground for hidden potential, and a bridge between the military and civilian worlds that had seemed incompatible just weeks earlier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to prove that talent could flourish anywhere if given the right support. But tonight she was content to savor a victory that had been won not through political maneuvering or bureaucratic influence, but through the simple power of transformed lives and realized potential. 1 year later, Isabel stood before an audience that would have been unimaginable when she first arrived in Westfield. The library had expanded into a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings, housing classrooms, tactical simulation rooms, and technology centers that buzzed with activity 18 hours a day. The Westfield Institute for Community Intelligence had become a model studied by security agencies and educational institutions worldwide. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in the buildings or equipment. It was in the people who now called this place their professional home. David Chen adjusted his newly earned master's degree hood as he prepared to address the graduating class of 37 students from the Institute's first full-year program. As the program's first graduate to complete advanced tactical analysis training while maintaining his civilian library duties, he had become a symbol of what was possible when community service merged with national security expertise. 2 years ago, David began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, I thought my ceiling was helping people find the right reference books and maintaining historical archives. I never imagined standing here with advanced certifications in intelligence analysis, speaking to people who will design the future of Homeland Security. In the audience, Isabel felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came when watching potential transform into achievement. Beside David on the platform sat Margaret, now the Institute's Director of Pattern Recognition Training, and Timothy, who had overcome his learning challenges to become a specialist in digital threat assessment. The graduation ceremony represented more than individual achievements. It marked the maturation of an idea that had seemed impossible when Isabel first proposed combining community service with intelligence training in a small-town library. Admiral Rebecca Hayes, now serving as the Pentagon's liaison for civilian-military intelligence partnerships, delivered the keynote address. Her presence symbolized how dramatically the relationship between traditional military structure and innovative thinking had evolved. When I first heard about Commander Morgan's work in Westfield, Admiral Hayes told the gathered families and dignitaries, I made the mistake of thinking this was about teaching librarians to think like soldiers. What I discovered was something far more revolutionary, teaching soldiers to think like community members. She gestured toward the graduates, who represented a diverse cross-section of backgrounds and ages. Former retail workers sat beside recent college graduates. Veterans transitioning to civilian careers shared the stage with teachers, seeking to enhance their threat assessment skills. Retirees who had volunteered for community service programs now held certificates in advanced security analysis. These graduates prove that intelligence gathering isn't about creating an elite class of specialists isolated from the communities they protect, Admiral Hayes continued. It's about recognizing that the people who know their communities best are often the most effective at identifying threats and building resilience. As the Admiral concluded her remarks, Isabel reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The painful betrayal that had driven her from active duty now seemed like a necessary detour rather than a career-ending catastrophe. Without that humiliation, she never would have discovered the profound satisfaction of building something entirely new rather than simply advancing within existing structures. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lieutenant Colonel Webb's attorney, client convicted on all counts, 15-year sentence. Your testimony was decisive. Isabel deleted the message without responding, as she had done with similar communications from prosecutors and military justice officials who wanted to celebrate Webb's downfall. She had learned that some victories were too important to risk on the satisfaction of revenge. Professor Morgan, she turned to find Maria Rodriguez, David's wife, holding their youngest daughter. David wanted me to give you this. Maria handed her a framed photograph showing the Institute's opening day ceremony. Isabel barely recognized herself in the image. Tentative, still carrying the defensive posture of someone expecting attack at any moment. Beside her stood David, Margaret, and Timothy, their faces mixing hope with uncertainty as they embarked on an experiment that none of them fully understood. He says this is where everything changed, Maria continued, not just for him, but for all of us, for the whole community. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered for celebration, Isabel found herself standing alone on the platform, looking out over the crowd of graduates, families, and supporters. The scene reminded her of countless military ceremonies she had attended in her former life. But the energy was completely different. Those events had been about hierarchy and individual achievement within established structures. This celebration was about collaboration and community transformation that transcended traditional boundaries. Commander, she turned to find Detective Morrison approaching with a package wrapped in simple brown paper. His department had evolved from skeptical observers to enthusiastic partners in the Institute's work, and Morrison himself had become one of Isabel's most effective advocates. "The department wanted me to give you this," Morrison said, his voice carrying emotions that would have been impossible to imagine during their first confrontational encounter. Isabel unwrapped the package to reveal a brass plaque bearing the Westfield Police Department insignia and an inscription, "To Commander Isabel Morgan, who taught us that the best intelligence comes from understanding the people we serve." "The ceremony is meaningful," Isabel said, accepting the honor with genuine gratitude. "But the real reward is watching people discover capabilities they never knew they possessed." "Speaking of which," Morrison replied, "I have news. The FBI has approved funding for 7 additional institutes. They want to use our model in communities across the country." Isabel felt the familiar mixture of pride and apprehension that accompanied every expansion opportunity. Growth was necessary for impact, but it also risked diluting the personal connections that made the institute's approach so effective. "Who would run them?" she asked. "Graduates from our program," Morrison explained. "David has agreed to establish the first one in Denver. Margaret's interested in the Pacific Northwest location. Timothy wants to focus on developing virtual training modules that can support all the institutes remotely." The beauty of the plan struck Isabel immediately. Rather than expanding through bureaucratic replication or corporate franchise, the institute would grow organically through people who understood its mission from personal experience. As the celebration continued into the evening, Isabel found herself walking through the original library building, now preserved as both a functional workspace and a monument to the power of quiet transformation. The circulation desk, where she had spent 7 years checking out books, now served as a reception area for visiting security officials and academic researchers. Her father's photograph sat on what had once been her workstation, his words as relevant now as they had been during her darkest moments. "Leadership isn't about rank, it's about knowing when to step forward." She traced the frame gently, thinking about how those words had guided her through betrayal, exile, and ultimately redemption. But the redemption hadn't come through vindication or revenge. It had come through discovering that her greatest talent wasn't commanding operations, but creating opportunities for others to discover their own potential. "Isabel?" She turned to find Timothy standing in the doorway, his graduation cap askew from enthusiastic embraces. "I wanted to thank you for something specific." "What's that?" "For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself," he said quietly. "For making me understand that learning differently didn't mean learning less. It meant learning better, in ways that other people couldn't." "You did the work," Isabel replied. "I just provided the opportunity." "No," Timothy said, shaking his head with the certainty of someone who had spent 2 years analyzing patterns that others missed. "You provided something more important than opportunity. You provided belief. You made me understand that my value wasn't determined by other people's expectations of what intelligence should look like." As Timothy left to rejoin his celebration, Isabel remained in the quiet original library, surrounded by the books and memories that had reshaped her understanding of service, leadership, and fulfillment. 2 years ago, she had stood in this same spot as a disgraced former officer convinced that her career was over. Tonight, she stood here as the founder of an educational movement that was transforming how America approached community security and human potential development. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to disappear, she had discovered her true calling. In accepting what seemed like failure, she had found a success more meaningful than any military achievement. In learning to serve a small community, she had developed a model that could serve the entire nation. Her phone buzzed one final time with a message from an unknown number. "Commander Morgan, I'm a veteran in Phoenix who's been struggling to find purpose after my service ended. I heard about your institute on the news. Is there hope for someone like me?" Isabel smiled as she typed her response. "There's always hope. Purpose doesn't end when service transitions. It evolves. Let's talk about how your experience can serve your community in ways you might not have imagined." As she turned off the lights and secured the building, Isabel reflected on the question that had haunted her since the day Detective Morrison first challenged her qualifications. If you found yourself dismissed and underestimated, would you speak up immediately or let your actions do the talking? She had learned that the answer wasn't either-or. Sometimes dignity required patience while you built strength. Sometimes justice demanded speaking truth to power. But always the most powerful response was creating opportunities for others to discover their own voices and use them in service of something larger than themselves. The drive home took her past the welcome sign that still proudly declared Westfield's population and founding date. But the town she was leaving that night was fundamentally different from the one she had discovered 7 years earlier. Not because of buildings or programs, but because of transformed perspectives and expanded possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that potential existed everywhere if people were brave enough to nurture it. Isabel drove through the quiet streets of her adopted hometown, finally understanding that home wasn't where you came from. It was where you chose to build something that would outlast your own presence there. 5 years after that first confrontation with Detective Morrison, Isabel stood at the podium of the National Security Education Conference in Washington, D.C., addressing an audience of military leaders, intelligence officials, and community organizers from across the globe. The woman who had once hidden behind library stacks to avoid attention now commanded the attention of some of the most powerful people in national security. But the most meaningful faces in the audience weren't the generals or cabinet members. They were the dozens of graduates from Westfield and the 6 sister institutes that had sprouted across America, each one a testament to the revolutionary idea that community service and national security were not separate missions, but complementary aspects of protecting democracy. 7 years ago, Isabel began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned that true authority comes not from rank but from results. I believed that intelligence work required isolation from the communities we served. I thought that effectiveness meant maintaining distance, that professionalism meant staying separate from the people whose lives hung in the balance of our decisions. She paused, looking out over an audience that included Admiral Hayes, now Secretary of Naval Operations, Detective Morrison, recently promoted to Chief of Police, and Dorothy Patterson, whose small-town library had become the epicenter of a national transformation in security thinking. I was completely wrong. The admission drew knowing smiles from the Westfield graduates scattered throughout the auditorium. They had heard this story before, but they never tired of hearing how their mentor's journey from exile to innovation had reshaped American approaches to homeland security. Henceforth, the most effective intelligence doesn't come from surveillance or sophisticated technology, Isabel continued. It comes from understanding the rhythms of daily life so thoroughly that you can instantly recognize when something doesn't belong. And that understanding can only be developed by people who are genuinely invested in the communities they protect. Behind her, a massive screen displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible 7 years earlier. Crime prevention rates in communities with institute-trained personnel had improved by 340%. Early intervention in potential violence had increased by 600%. Most remarkably, community trust in law enforcement had reached historic highs in areas where officers had completed the Institute's community intelligence training. But Isabel knew that statistics, however impressive, couldn't capture the real story. The real story was in individual transformations that had rippled outward to change families, neighborhoods, and entire communities. She clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of Maria Santos, a former grocery store clerk from the Phoenix Institute, who had identified and prevented a domestic terrorism plot by recognizing subtle changes in customer behavior patterns. Next came James Liu, a retired factory worker from Seattle whose analysis of social media trends had helped authorities intervene before 3 potential school shootings reached crisis points. These aren't professional intelligence officers, Isabel explained to the rapt audience. They're community members who learn to see their everyday experiences as valuable intelligence sources. They represent a fundamental shift in how we think about security, from protecting people to empowering them to protect themselves and each other. In the audience, David Chen sat with his wife and children, wearing the uniform of a lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserve, a rank he'd earned through his groundbreaking work developing community intelligence protocols for coastal security. Beside him, Margaret Williams adjusted her new FBI credentials, having been recruited to lead the Bureau's Community Intelligence Division based on her innovative pattern recognition methods. Timothy Rodriguez watched from the press section, his notebook filled with details for the documentary he was producing about the Institute movement. His learning differences, once seen as obstacles, had become his greatest strengths in developing early warning systems that identified threats through unconventional data patterns. The traditional model of intelligence work assumes that expertise flows from the top down, Isabel continued, warming to the theme that had defined her work for 5 years. Specialists analyze threats and pass recommendations to communities, but we've discovered that the most accurate intelligence flows from the bottom up, from people who live and work in the places they're protecting. She advanced to a slide showing the global expansion of the community intelligence model. 17 countries had sent delegations to study the Westfield approach. The European Union had funded 3 pilot programs based on Isabel's methodologies. Even traditionally secretive agencies like the CIA had quietly begun implementing community integration protocols in their domestic operations. "This isn't just an American innovation," Isabel said. "It's a recognition that democracy's greatest strength has always been its people. When we trust communities with responsibility for their own security, when we give them the tools and training to recognize and respond to threats, we don't just make them safer, we make them stronger." The presentation concluded with a video montage of institute graduates from across the country. A librarian in Montana who had identified cybersecurity vulnerabilities in rural infrastructure. A teacher in Florida whose classroom management skills had translated into remarkable abilities to detect radicalization in students. A mechanic in Ohio whose understanding of equipment maintenance had led to innovations in detecting sabotage of critical infrastructure. As the applause died down, Isabel was approached by Admiral Hayes, who had been her strongest supporter during the darkest days of the Webb investigation and her most effective advocate for the Institute's expansion. "Isabel," the Admiral said, using the informal address that had developed over years of collaboration, "I have a proposition that I think you'll find interesting." "What kind of proposition?" "The President wants to create a new cabinet position. Secretary of Community Security, someone who can coordinate domestic intelligence, community resilience, and citizen engagement at the national level." Admiral Hayes paused, studying Isabel's reaction. "You're the only person being considered for the position." The offer hung in the air like a culmination of everything Isabel had worked toward since leaving the Navy. A cabinet position would give her unprecedented authority to implement community intelligence programs nationwide, to reshape how America thought about security and citizenship. But as she considered the proposal, Isabel found herself thinking about the original Westfield Library, now preserved as a museum within the expanded Institute complex. She thought about the quiet satisfaction of helping individual patrons find the information they needed, the personal connections that had taught her more about human nature than any classified briefing ever could. "That's an incredible honor," she said finally, "but I need to ask, would this position require me to move to Washington? To operate within the existing bureaucratic structure?" Admiral Hayes smiled, recognizing the concern behind the question. "Actually, no. The President specifically wants this position to be community-based. The idea is that the Secretary of Community Security should live and work within an actual community, maintaining the grassroots perspective that makes the Institute model so effective." Isabel felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. The fear that success would pull her away from the community work that had given her life meaning was replaced by the possibility of scaling that work to help the entire nation. "In that case," she said, "I'd be honored to serve." As the conference concluded and attendees dispersed to airports and hotels, Isabel found herself walking through the corridors of the Pentagon with Detective Morrison, now Chief Morrison, who had become one of her closest collaborators and most trusted friends. "Hard to believe this all started with you quietly correcting my tactical analysis in a library," Morrison said, his tone mixing amazement with genuine affection. "You gave me the push I needed," Isabel replied. "Sometimes it takes someone challenging your competence to remind you that competence without courage is just wasted potential." They paused at a window overlooking the Potomac River, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the water. In the distance, Isabel could see the Capitol building where she would soon be sworn in as the first Secretary of Community Security. "What's the first thing you'll do in the new position?" Morrison asked. Isabel considered the question, thinking about all the communities across America where potential lay dormant, waiting for someone to recognize and nurture it. "I'm going to make sure that what happened in Westfield, people discovering capabilities they never knew they had, happens everywhere. I'm going to prove that America's greatest security asset isn't our technology or our military might, it's our people, when they're empowered to protect and serve each other." As they prepared to leave, Morrison handed her a small wrapped package. "This is from the entire Westfield community. They wanted you to have it before you take on the new role." Isabel unwrapped the gift to find a simple leather-bound notebook, its pages blank and ready for new ideas. On the cover, embossed in gold letters, were the words her father had written on that photograph so many years ago. "Leadership isn't about rank, it's about knowing when to step forward." He, Inside the front cover, in handwriting she recognized as Dorothy's, was a note. For Isabel, who taught us that the most important question isn't, what can you do for your community, but what can your community discover about itself when someone believes in its potential. That evening, as Isabel flew back to Westfield to pack for her move to the nation's capital, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from a disgraced former Navy officer hiding in a small-town library to the architect of a new approach to national security. The path had been neither straight nor predictable, marked by setbacks that had felt like endings but turned out to be beginnings. She thought about all the people who had been part of that journey: David, who had taught her that curiosity was more valuable than credentials; Margaret, who had shown her that wisdom often came disguised as quiet competence; Timothy, who had proven that different ways of thinking were strengths, not limitations. Most of all, she thought about the hundreds of institute graduates now serving in communities across America, each one carrying forward the lesson that had taken her years to learn, that true security came not from protecting people, but from empowering them to protect each other. As the plane descended toward Westfield, Isabel could see the lights of the Institute complex spreading across what had once been farmland. It looked, she thought, like a constellation, individual points of light connected by invisible threads, creating something beautiful and functional and enduring. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a new role and new opportunities to prove that democracy's greatest strength lay in its people. But tonight, she was content to return home to the community that had taught her the most important lesson of all, that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you were truly meant to do. The woman who had once hidden her capabilities to avoid conflict was now ready to spend the rest of her career helping others discover and develop their own hidden potential. And in that transformation, Isabel finally understood lay the real victory. Not just personal redemption, but a revolution in how America thought about service, security, and the unlimited potential of its citizens. The quiet librarian had become something she'd never imagined possible, a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the underestimated, and a living reminder that in America, anyone could step forward when their community needed them most. Some stories end with the hero returning to where they started, others end with the hero moving on to greater adventures. But the best stories, Isabel realized, end with the hero helping others begin their own journeys of discovery and service. And in Westfield, across America, and soon around the world, those journeys were just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.